When alone at night, he was aggressively confronted by forest. First one was in June of 2007 at Onion Lake, Humboldt County, where we found 13.5-inch tracks at the lakeside in the mud. We made plaster casts of them, and they were sent to Dr. Meldrum at Idaho State University. While I was casting the tracks, there was wood knocking going on the hill to the north of me. I stopped casting and started wood knocking back at the knocking I was hearing. Well, it was not just me, my ex-girlfriend Candy was there too. I would knock 3 times and then it would knock 3 times back. Then after a few times of doing this, there was wood knocking coming from another location as well on the other side of the lake. Candy tried to go up the hill towards the site of the first knocking, as she said she could hear something moving away from her up the hill through the... When we came back about an hour later, I was pulling the cast out of the ground when the wood knocking started again, but much more forceful and almost violent in tempo. Here's a picture of the footprint before the cast was made. About 3 weeks after the Onion Lake incident, I went back to retrieve the camera traps and stayed the weekend at Louse Camp with a friend of mine named Carol. And while we were there, we had 2 incidents take place. The first one was early in the morning, where I was walking up the road out of Louse Camp and heard something in the brush moving around. I motioned to my friend to come over, and she could hear it too. I asked her to go back down to camp and get my video camera. Then I called out towards the brush that if they were human, I was armed, and then a branch that was hanging off a tree pretty high up started bouncing up and down. I moved to see if I could identify where the branch was being grabbed, and saw it bounce a rock thrown about the size of a billiard ball about 10 feet behind me on the road. My friend came running back up from the camp with my camera, and I turned it on and went right into the bush towards the sounds, and you could hear it moving up the hill away from us. I ran back down the hill and up the road to try and get around it, but never got close again. We did hear what sounded like someone clearing their throat, but no more movement. We went back down to camp and ate some food, and when I was washing up, I noticed about 40 yards away on the north side of the campground, a large dark-colored figure standing next to a tree. I asked my friend Carol to step over and told her to take a look as well. Neither of us had our glasses on at that time, so I went to put them on, and whatever was standing there was now gone. She identified the same tree I saw and said it was gone too. I went and stood next to the tree, and the Bigfoot was probably about 6 feet tall, but very broad. I'm 6'1", and it was about the same height as me, judging on a branch that was hanging off this tree. Louse Camp is the same camp that Patterson and Gimlin stayed at while they were at Bluff Creek. Sean Fries. November of 2004 at the Aikens Creek campground on the Klamath River. We found a bunch of footprints there, and the interesting thing is that they were fresh tracks, because the night before there was a big rainstorm and they would have been washed away, but the rain stopped around 2 a.m., so they were made sometime after that. We stayed the night there and put out bait traps, but nothing touched them. However, something took a whole bag of apples that my friend had leaning against his front wheel of his car. We never found the plastic bag. It was like something carried the whole bag off. Here are some of the tracks we found. Sean Fries. The following event occurred Sunday morning, 2 to 3 a.m. on Labor Day weekend, September 1991, Klamath National Forest, California, west of the Klamath River. We had followed the river north until we found a feeder stream and headed west. We observed a form walking upright at a distance of 200 plus yards. We were a little excited, more like scared. There was enough light just to make out whatever it was moved upright on 2 legs. We found where it gouged out the soft earth on the stream it crossed. No discernible footprint, but whatever made the gouge was big. We had to guess at the length, over 19 inches. It was longer than the tip of my extended fingers to my elbow. Several hours later, I was asleep when my friend woke me up. Said he heard something moving above us on the exposed rock above our camp. He had his 9mm in hand and was a little wound up. We listened to it move around with the occasional skip, like something or someone might be jumping a short distance to another rock. It moved behind us, then down into the meadow that surrounded the stream we were camping on. We saw it cross the stream and slip as it went across on the other side. It moved across the meadow at a quartering angle away from us and into the tree line. We know it wasn't a bear. We had several run-ins with bears, trying to get our food cache at night in Yosemite. Thought we could get away from the crowds on this backpacking trip. Good call, huh? Once we calmed down, we discussed what we think we saw. We both came to the same conclusion. I know we didn't hallucinate. Our eyes had time to adjust before we finally got a visual of it moving across the meadow. We stayed awake until we had enough light to look the area over quickly and then beat feet out of there. We are both credible Air Force pilots going through training at Castle Air Force Base in Merced, California. We would go backpacking 1 weekend a month instead of swilling beer. 1970s. Although I tell the stories occasionally, I have never officially reported any of these sightings to anyone. For several years, I worked for the Bureau of Public Roads under the Federal Highway Administration. We only worked in national parks and national forests. Working in these somewhat remote locations, Bigfoot opportunities seemed to crop up every time I turned my head. Number 1. We were surveying a timber access road about 5 miles up the Bluff Creek Road. At that time, a dirt road ran alongside the creek for a ways. From there, we hiked into an area to be timbered and survey out the main road to avoid advance bidder inquiries. Hiking in one morning in July 1974, we noticed how quiet it was. Usually, there are birds and other animal sounds. I had a German Shepherd and my friend had his husky with him. Both dogs stayed right under our feet and weren't running and playing as they normally did. We sat down on a deer trail to rest. Between my friend and I, we noticed a footprint in the dust of the trail. We followed the tracks to the area where we had been working the day before. We followed the tracks for another 200 feet, and at that point, they broke over the top of the ridge into some fairly thick growth. While standing there trying to decide if we should follow the tracks, we heard a blood-curdling scream which answered our question for us. The tracks were measured at 16.5 inches long, and the stride was measured at just over 6 feet heel to toe. We took pictures of the tracks and included a wad of hair we found hanging on a sharp limb about 6 feet off the ground and mailed them to our office in Denver, Colorado. We were afraid to go back out there, but our office told us we could carry guns if we wanted. We decided against that, but did manage to go back out there and collect the samples we mailed to the office. Number 2. I was living in Sequoia National Park, staying in a Park Service cabin in November 1970. I was alone in the cabin as the fire season was pretty much over. While lying on my cot one night, I see the silhouette of a large head and shoulders pass my window and wondered who was outside. It dawned on me that the window was 6 feet above the ground. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Number 3. Also in Sequoia, but only reported to me. Our contractor sent his backhoe operator and a laborer up to the borrow pit to bring the backhoe down to the project site. The borrow pit is a location away from the road where additional soil may be excavated for the road work we were doing. In short time, the truck they were in came flying down the road. These 2 men went up to my boss and I and asked if there were any sightings of Bigfoot in the area. It seemed that when they arrived at the pit, they noticed large footprints all around the equipment. They followed the prints over a steep bluff, and there, standing at the top of the bluff, they saw a large, hairy creature, obviously upset that they were there. They said the creature was hitting the ground and screaming to the point they decided they better leave. I was also privy to a sighting just outside of Hayfork, California. While with a survey crew working at Peanut, but staying in a real nice Forest Service barrack facility in Hayfork, I had to make a trip that day, so I didn't go out to the field. I was in the mess hall making a late breakfast when 3 Forest Service types came in. One was obviously distressed, seemed the other 2 were trying to calm him down. As they told the story, the person was marking trees for removal by a timber contractor and had a funny feeling all morning that something was following him. He finally doubled back along his own trail to see. He said as he walked up to a large tree, a giant creature covered with hair stepped right in front of him, saying he was face to face with Bigfoot. Well, I guess this guy ran off the hill at a pretty good clip, and it took a while to stop him. He said he would never go back out there, and if my recollection is correct, they brought in a helicopter to take him down the hill. That pretty much sums things up. Not my imagination, just the way things happen. Take these stories for what they're worth. Sincerely, Dave Roden. I'm a registered tribal member of the Hoopa tribe in Northern California. I've had several incidents concerning Bigfoot. I grew up in a town called Arcata and lived in Hoopa on weekends and during the summer with my grandparents. I had heard all my youth about stories of the creature that lives in the woods. He was never something to be feared, as my grandmother would say. In fact, she made them out to be almost heroic in a sense. I somewhat believed, and didn't, as there was a lot of stories being told of Bigfoot. In the summer of '88, I was with my grandfather hunting in the woods up Big Hill Road on a logging road. We had not seen anything most of the morning. My grandfather was about 20 feet in front of me when he stopped dead in his tracks and looked around. I was looking as well for a deer, bear, or something. I began to smell something very sour, almost like a skunk, but not quite the same. I had no idea what it was since I knew firsthand what a skunk smelled like. My grandfather walked back to me and told me to get in the bushes and stay there. I did as I was told and waited quietly and patiently. I heard something about 50 yards away, but not sure what it was. The way the woods echo sound, it could have been farther out, but I was a little scared, so I figured it was close. My grandfather stood straight up and began making loud noises, stomping his feet and laughing. I had no idea what he was doing, and I didn't know what to think. The sound stopped and disappeared. My grandfather told me to get up, and I should now chalk some of that up to Indian folklore and beliefs, but I know something was there, and my grandfather knew exactly what it was. I have since longed to smell the sour smell again, and maybe even see the Bigfoot. I've been in the woods thousands of times and never had quite an ordeal since, but I have seen things that are rather curious. I have seen trees debarked several feet higher than a bear can reach to scratch. I have seen fish remains in the creeks that seem to have been cleaned, but not with a knife. I am a believer, and I've heard many tales of the creature over my lifetime. I have had many different things happen to me while living on the reservation, but nothing was as real as that day in the woods. Thank you for your time. Vision Rider of the Hoopa Tribe. Well, it's been a couple of years since it happened, but here goes. I was stationed at Beale Air Force Base, California, and I would always drive around looking for the next great fishing hole. I'd been driving for quite some time and had decided to pull into Humboldt Redwood State Park. Being from Alabama, I figured seeing these big redwoods would be kind of cool. So I got off Highway 101 and took the Avenue of Giants exit. Driving down the road, I was amazed at the size of the trees, so they kind of grabbed my attention. I started seeing a lot of places where I was thinking I could fish, so I started to slow down even more to find a place to park. As I kept driving, the river kind of started getting a little farther away, and I was about to turn around. When out of nowhere, something walked across the road, and to say the least, it shocked the you-know-what out of me. The reason why it got me a little jumpy was because of the fact that I had to have come within a couple of feet of this thing. Now, I'm a pretty big guy, 6 feet and about 220 pounds, but whatever walked in front of my truck had to have been over 7 feet tall, due to the height of the truck, a Chevy Z71. Now, when it comes to the poundage of this thing, I would have to say it was well over 350 pounds. As far as physical features, all I saw was the back and arm swing. The thing never turned around for me to get a better look at it, but it had a large back and rather long arms. As far as the neck goes, it didn't really have one. The animal's traps made it look like it didn't have a neck, kinda like me. But after I did find a place to turn around, I went back to look around. Dumb, I know, to say the least. I only found a couple of tracks. They had to have been 14 to 15 inches long, plus the stride of this thing was a lot longer than mine. Just to make the stride this thing did, I had to make one heck of an effort. Now, all I can say is, whatever I saw that day was nothing like anything I'd ever seen in the woods. And I grew up in the outdoors. Summer 2000. My neighbor is a seasonal wildlife biological technician for Redwood National Park. He'd been working several seasons doing spotted owl surveys and is very familiar with the local wildlife. One evening just before sunset, he and his partner were walking with a cage of 6 mice that had sat in the same cage without being cleaned for 3 to 4 days, and it smelled pretty bad. They were several miles south of Bald Hills Road at about 2,000 feet, up an approximately 3,000-foot mountain, in extremely rugged and isolated terrain several miles from the nearest logging road. After bushwhacking for about 30 minutes heading downhill, they stopped in their tracks when they heard a large branch snap. There are a lot of bears and mountain lions in the area, and they are familiar with stalking cats. The creature was quick and agile like a cat, but sounded heavier than a bear. It also sounded like it was walking on 2 legs. They would hear it behind them, and a little later it would be way ahead of them, sometimes on the other side of them. They figured it was crossing right behind them and then passing them up on the other side. By this time it was getting dark in the forest, late twilight, when my friend started looking over his shoulder quite frequently. It was at this time that he saw a large dark animal dash across the trail on 2 legs. He has seen the PG film and is familiar with Sasquatch, and he says that it moved with the same motion, just much quicker. He also noted it seemed a little thinner than Patty. My 8-year-old son and I were hiking the Grasshopper Trail in Humboldt Redwood State Park, Burlington Campgrounds. The time was approximately between 3 and 4 p.m. on Sunday, August 22nd, 1999. We were about a quarter mile up the trail from the river. We were walking relatively quiet and slow along the path when we stopped on the path for a moment for my son to tie his shoe. As I waited, I surveyed the thick redwood area above. As I looked, I noticed something moving about 150 to 200 feet in the distance next to a large old redwood stump. The more I looked, I began to see more mass of the creature. I finally realized what it probably was, and what it was doing. It had a human-like torso from the waist up, and it appeared as if it was scratching its back against the stump. I gained a back and profile view before I could no longer overcome the intense fear I was experiencing. I urged my son, as serious as I could, to run as fast as he could. After running for about 30 seconds to a minute, we stopped. I wanted badly to go back and investigate, but understood I could not do this with my son. I know the exact location of where the stump is, and I plan to go back within the week. I hope to find something at that stump. It was a typical winter afternoon in Humboldt County in March of 1999. It was raining intermittently, and the river was on the rise and becoming too turbid to fish. But I wanted to catch another steal before the river blew out, so I drove down to the river bar. I parked about 30 yards away from the river's edge, on a dirt road surrounded by dense willows. I turned off the car and opened the door. Immediately, I heard two bellows that seemed far off. I initially thought it was local kids. The sound was similar to the bugle of a bull elk. I used to work as a horse patrol park ranger on the eastern slope of the Rockies in Rocky Mountain National Park. I kept visitors away from the elk. In addition, I have frequently heard elk bugle near Oric, California. I know the bugle of an elk. That's not what this was. Well, I didn't think much of it, so I got my waders on and proceeded to the river's edge. I waded in up to my thigh and began fishing, moving slowly downstream. The river was probably about 50 yards wide and nearly at bank full. About 10 minutes went by and I noticed a dark figure downstream and across the river, seemingly standing behind a large root wad. I could see what I thought was a head and shoulders of a bear or something. It was drizzling and I couldn't focus on it at first. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I thought it might just be part of the root wad. As I fished downstream, I worked my way directly across from it and looked at it again. I looked right into its eyes. They were dark. It didn't move. I then saw another to its left. I could see its body from the thigh up. It didn't move. It was looking slightly downstream, and I couldn't see its eyes. These things looked taller than a man, had flat faces, and large round eyes. Their shoulders were broad, and their arms were long. They were mostly covered in hair, although the one on the left seemed to have bald spots on its chest area, like mange. They stood still, never once moved. I kept fishing and tried to work downstream of them to a tailout where I could cross and sneak up on them to get a closer look. The river was too high. As I worked back upstream, I noticed a cocoon-shaped object perched on the root wad overhanging the river's edge. It was shaped like a football, but it was probably 4 feet long and 2.5 feet in diameter. Hard to tell at 50 yards. The cocoon thing appeared to be neatly wrapped in dry grasses, like cattail or pampas grass blades. I kept fishing, moving upstream of them back toward my car. At one point, I looked back to get another look, and the cocoon thing and the animals were gone. A day later, I drove to the other side of the river to go see if I could track them, but the river had flooded the entire area. Thanks for listening. If you've had an encounter or sighting of a Sasquatch and would like your story told here, please email me, Lynn Smith, at bigfootcasefiles@mail.com. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.